Okay, welcome everyone to the University of Texas Energy Symposium for April 2nd, 2024. I'm Kerry King, Assistant Director and Research Scientist at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. And before I introduce today's speaker, I will point out some upcoming talks. These are the last two talks of the semester this spring. Next week, we will have Jim Brown and Charlie Hall, who are two colleagues of mine who are ecologists and biologists. And we're going to talk about what biology and ecology can teach us about energy and the economy, or how do we think about how ecosystems operate and growth there, and how economies operate and economic growth. And then after, that's actually not the right title for David Spence's talk, April 16th. Apologies for that, David. David Spence, who is a professor here in the LBJ School, or the Business School and the Law School, sorry. And he will be giving a book talk. He has a book that's finishing up, and he was having a book about sort of all the discussions about dealing with climate change and sort of the narratives around this and how we can kind of navigate the politics of climate change. So that's actually the title of his talk, not the one displayed here. So now, with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce again, one of our own here at the University of Texas, Jackson Dorsey, is an assistant professor of economics here at UT Austin. He got his PhD from University of Arizona in economics, and he focuses on environmental economics, industrial organization, and energy economics. So all things I like to think about myself. His recent work is on understanding market impacts of clean technologies, such as solar, photovoltaics, electric vehicles, and energy storage. And he's looking at policies that determine energy technology adoption and this kind of thing. So his abstract today, he will discuss issues related to decarbonizing the electricity sector, thinking about innovations in renewable energy, electricity storage, carbon capture. These are all promising pathways. Perhaps we're not implementing them enough as some people might want. So a successful path requires maintaining affordability of energy costs and ensuring reliability. So we'll look at challenges here and why market forces alone are insufficient for solving the carbon pollution problem. So he'll look at the policies for clean energy, evaluate the role of renewable energy in our transition, and discuss shortcomings of current policies and what we can do to lower carbon emissions further. So with that said, let's welcome Jackson Dorsey for the presentation. Thank you. Over.
All right, thanks a lot for having me, Kerry. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm going to, as Kerry pointed out, I'm going to be talking about decarbonization of the electricity sector. Now, this is a topic I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but just to motivate it a bit, it probably doesn't need too much motivation for the people in this room. But if we look at greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions across sectors in the US, we can see, and I pulled this figure from the EPA. It's a couple of years old, but I think that the pie graph has held up pretty well over the last couple of years. About a quarter of our emissions are coming from transportation, about a quarter from electric power, a quarter from industrial activity, and then the last quarter from commercial and residential and agriculture. So we can see that electricity sector is a substantial chunk of that pie. But I'd argue that decarbonization of the electricity sector is also important because it has implications for the transportation sector. So the idea being here, a lot of people see a path forward for decarbonization is plugging in a lot of our transportation into the electric grid, the electric vehicles, electric trucks. Now, that's only going to actually help us reduce emissions if the electricity sector is producing using low carbon sources. So decarbonizing the electricity sector is going to be really critical for getting our greenhouse gases down. Now, if we look at kind of the history of electricity generation and CO2 emissions in the US, we can see from the 70s to the early 2000s, we were using more and more electricity over time. In the last 10 to 20 years, that's really flattened out. So we're using about the same amount of electricity now as we were around 2005. That's in large part because we've improved energy efficiency and other things along those lines. But one of the other trends that we see, if we look at CO2 emissions generated from the electricity sector, we have seen a sharp decline in CO2 emissions from electricity over the last 15 years or so. Just to kind of gauge the audience, I know a lot of you guys have a lot of experience in the energy sector. So what are kind of the two main reasons why we've seen a decline in CO2 emissions over the last 15 years?
Coal to gas and renewables.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of the two reasons why we've seen this sharp decline in CO2 emissions. One is that we've seen a lot of substitution from coal power plants towards natural gas, and that's been a result of developing new hydraulic fracturing technologies that made it a lot cheaper to get natural gas out of the ground. So one thing we can see is, when we were at peak emissions in 2005, we were getting the vast majority of our electricity from coal. Coal has gone down really quickly. Natural gas has gone up similarly during that time period. And we've also seen a substantial uptick in renewable energy over that time period as well. So one of the key reasons that we've been able to expand renewables is we've just gotten much better at building and constructing renewables over time. If you looked at solar or wind technologies 20 years ago, they were very, very expensive relative to natural gas, coal power plants, these conventional technologies. This plots kind of the levelized cost of different types of power plants. So here we have kind of our fossil fuel technologies. In 2009, solar was much more expensive, but that cost has come down quite a lot in recent years. And even wind used to be more expensive than coal. It's now quite a lot cheaper. We'll talk a bit. I mean, obviously, there's also some limitations to these sources, but they have become much, much cheaper over time, which has helped drive an increase in adoption of these technologies. So we've made some progress on reducing CO2 emissions, but if you listen to a lot of recent policy advocacy, there's a lot of push to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector and also other sectors of the economy. And kind of the main motivation for that is, even though we've seen some progress in the electricity space, it's probably not enough progress to limit warming below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, which is a target that's been laid out kind of by scientists as something that we should aim for to mitigate the worst damages that we might see from climate change. So if we look at the current administration, they've instituted a pledge to get to 50% emissions reductions below that 2005 peak by 2030. So we've seen this decrease, but they're pledging to really bring that down a lot further. And at the state level, we've seen policies implemented that are actually even much more aggressive than what's being implemented at the national level. So, for example, some states like California have implemented 100% zero carbon electricity targets to be met somewhere in the 2030s or 2040s, depending on the state. Okay, so we have these pledges to get CO2 emissions down. Hopefully to help us deal with the climate problem. But I want to kind of highlight a couple trade-offs that we're going to have to face if we want to decarbonize further. So the two key opposing forces that may kind of push back against efforts to decarbonization are that we need to keep in mind how our decarbonization efforts affect affordability, and also how they affect reliability. So of course, we now have, we know how to generate low carbon electricity. We have the technology to do so. The question is, can we do so without increasing electricity costs to a point where it's going to be detrimental for other reasons? So, climate is of course a problem, but if we push up energy costs, that can be a problem as well. And we also want to make sure that we maintain reliability as well. I'm gonna focus the talk, just because we only have an hour, talk more about the affordability, but something just to keep in the back of your mind. In the US here, we're quite used to having very reliable electricity. I know in Texas, we've had a couple instances where we didn't have reliable electricity in the last couple winters. But that was like a big deal when we didn't have electricity for a couple hours or a couple days. Quite generally, over most of our lifetimes in the US, we're used to very, very reliable electricity supply. And there's reasons to believe that that's obviously going to be important for our well-being going forward, to make sure that electricity is kept reliable. So if we're thinking about decarbonization, we should really be aiming to pick policies that are going to allow us to decarbonize, but do so at the least economic cost possible. And also thinking about reliability as well. So why should we care about affordability? Maybe it's obvious why we should care, but when you're talking to some environmental groups, they might say the cost doesn't matter. We obviously we're thinking about our ecosystems, so it shouldn't matter how much it costs. But I would argue that we need to be thinking carefully about what the cost implications are of these policies. The first reason is that if we push up energy costs too much with green policy, we think about the types of people that are going to be the most impacted by that. We're going to think about mostly low and middle class families that are spending a large share of their income on energy expenses. So if your policies are really pushing up these prices quite a lot, that's going to be the most damaging for potentially lower income households that are spending more money on electricity and other energy costs. The other potential reason why keeping electricity costs reasonable is going to be important is if we want to think about that second angle of decarbonizing transportation by plugging into the electric grid. If electricity becomes very expensive, that's going to kind of push back against the incentive to electrify transportation. If people go, well, I'm spending a ton on electricity, I'm going to have to charge my EV at home. Electricity is way more expensive compared to gasoline, then it's going to look much less attractive to install an electric vehicle. Of course, what's been known for some time, energy inputs are key for a lot of both large and small businesses. So pushing up energy costs are going to likely have impacts on economic growth and the ability for businesses to maintain, to keep competitive on an international stage. And kind of the last point I want to highlight is if we want to achieve these climate-related goals, keeping energy costs in check is going to be somewhat critical for maintaining public support for these policies. So if we are decarbonizing, but we're not doing it in a least cost way, and we're spending excessive amounts of money and increasing energy costs too much, people are going to be more likely to push back against those policies, and they are not likely to be successful going forward. Okay, so I just want to kind of pause there and ask if for any questions or anything so far. Okay, so I want to kind of step in and think about a few different policy solutions that can help us to work towards decarbonizing the electricity sector and think about some of the pros and cons of each of them. So the first one that I want to start thinking about is kind of the policy solution that's the most popular amongst economists like me, but also kind of talk about some of the fallbacks of it as well. So the idea with a carbon tax is that if we think about power plants that are producing carbon emissions, these producers are creating a lot of economic good. We all are using electricity. We're using it right now. So I'm not saying, fossil fuel plants are doing all bad. They're creating goods and service that we value. But as a byproduct of their production activities, they're also creating a pollutant. Now, this pollutant is, going up into the atmosphere and going to contribute to future warming, which is going to impose other costs on society. So when these plants are engaging in production, they're imposing these what economists call externalities on the rest of society. The idea of a carbon tax is that producers should pay for the cost that they're imposing on other people. So, if you are, living here in Austin and you go over and vandalize your neighbor's house, they can file a civil suit and make you responsible for the damages. So the same idea is here, but it's a way to implement it in a much more organized fashion, which is essentially that emitters should be paying for the pollution costs that they create. So that's kind of the intuition for it. So economists have been pretty gung-ho on carbon pricing for a while. And they've argued that this is potentially the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. The reason why they make that argument is carbon pricing can encourage emissions reductions on a few different fronts. So one, it's going to encourage conservation, at least in terms of production that's polluting. So if you're using a good and service that's creating pollution as a byproduct, it's going to send a price signal that you're going to have to pay a penalty to do that. So it's going to incentivize conservation. It's going to also incentivize switching to cleaner fuels. So if we think about some of the switching we've already seen in the electricity sector over the last decade or so, from coal to gas, a carbon tax would make coal even more expensive relative to gas because it's more carbon intensive. And so it's going to encourage even more switching from coal to natural gas. Of course, renewables wouldn't have to pay this tax because they aren't creating carbon. So it would make renewables more attractive compared to fossil fuels. And perhaps kind of the biggest reason why economists might like this policy is it allows for a lot of flexibility. So the idea is that, me or the government or, really anyone may not know what the most cost-effective way is to reduce emissions in 5 years from now, 10 years from now. There might be new technologies that come out, and a carbon tax allows a lot of flexibility for people participating in the market to figure out cheap ways to reduce emissions. So it puts an incentive out there, and we have a lot of companies that create a ton of innovative products. It creates a financial incentive, but it doesn't legislate exactly what the solution should be. Okay, so that's kind of the argument for. There's a couple other things. You have tax revenue. There's a lot of things you could do with it. You could redistribute it to households. You could just basically have it send a price signal, send a check back to everyone at the end of the year. You could use it to reduce income taxes, for example, or you could use it to fund R&D in clean technology. There's a lot of things that you could potentially do with the tax code. Okay, so economists have been, saying carbon tax for a while, but the truth is no one has really listened to us, and I think that there's potentially good reason. And I'm more of the belief that we should be considering what's feasible as well. So even though this has been advocated by economists, it's been somewhat rare in practice. And economists have been criticized for kind of being out of touch with political realities for pushing this policy, and I think that that's a fair criticism. If we look at kind of how likely they've actually been implemented in practice. One thing I just want to show is for example, like Washington State had a carbon tax as a ballot initiative 2 times in the last 6 years, I believe, and it got voted down. Washington State is a pretty blue state, so if we think carbon tax might get passed anywhere, that probably would be a place where it has a decent shot, and it just hasn't been able to pass there. So I think, you know, the feasibility of this policy, I think, it is questionable at best. There's just a lot of pushback. People don't like implementing 2 new taxes. There's been pushes to kind of rebrand it, not call it a tax, but like at the end of the day, it is a tax. And there's not as much appetite for implementing new taxes as there is, on the other hand, for implementing a different type of policies. So if we look at kind of alternative policies that have become been much more successful, we can see policies that subsidize clean energy or even mandate clean energy have been much more likely to occur in practice. So I want to talk a bit more today about kind of alternative policies for decarbonization, particularly in the electricity space. So the first one I want to talk about is net energy metering. And then I'll talk about renewable energy mandates and renewable energy subsidies. These 2 can kind of be a little bit broader, could be kind of mandates or subsidies for other kind of clean tech, but the ones that we've seen the most in practice have been particularly for what's referred to as renewable energy sources. So the first policy that we've seen that's become quite popular in practice, at least in the United States, but also other countries have similar policies. So net metering is a policy which requires utility companies to buy back energy produced by a renewable source, usually solar, from the producer at the same price that utility sells to the grid. So the idea being, you know, you buy electricity from your utility company. If you're in Austin, that would be from Austin Energy. Net metering would be a legislative requirement that requires Austin Energy or whatever utility company that you work with. If you installed a solar panel on your rooftop, they'd have to buy back from you at the same retail rate they sell you electricity. So in practice, what this allows is if you install solar on your rooftop, this is going to help you offset a large portion or potentially all of your electricity bill that you're paying to the utility. If your solar panel is generating enough, you'll get credits for that production that gets sent back to the grid. Imagine, you know, during the day, you're not home. A lot of your solar power is going back into the grid. You come home, use electricity at night. They read your bill is going to be a net of how much you're consuming and how much you're producing. Seems fair, right? What might be so this policy, although it's seen a lot more popularity in practice, has seen kind of some recent pushback. And as we'll talk about later on, a lot of these net metering policies are kind of in the process of being changed. Is anyone familiar with net metering, or does anyone know kind of the arguments for why net metering might not be fair or a good idea?
I'm familiar with it. I don't really know that much enough to speak on the arguments.
Okay.
Want me to try? Oh. Yeah.
Someone else want to give it a crack?
Yeah. Producing at the same time the utility scale solar is depressing prices at a wholesale level, and that you're not necessarily recovering. You're not helping the utility recover its T&D costs, which serve you when the sun's not shining.
Yeah. Okay. So for people not familiar, T&D he's referring to transmission and distribution. So the idea is that when you pay the utility for for electricity, you're actually kind of paying them for a bundle of services. You're paying them for electrons that are coming to your house, but they're also maintaining this grid infrastructure to be there, which is all these distribution power lines that deliver power to your house. Of course, the electrons couldn't get there if they weren't maintaining that system. So when you're paying the utility, you're paying kind of for a bundled service of the electrons, but also this grid infrastructure to get it to your house. So the argument about why this may not be fair, and obviously an argument popular with utilities, and I think that they're making a fair point, is that when you as a solar producer are sending power back into the grid, you're providing electrons, but you aren't actually providing these grid services that the utility is. So while the adoption of solar panels is desirable from an environmental perspective, net metering does come at a cost to utilities. And the idea is that these households with PV installations still require network energy. Your solar system is not generating at night, so you still need to be connected to the grid in order to get power, and you still rely on that grid. Under net metering, solar households are going to contribute less to these costs. And what the result of that is going to be is that the utility still has to maintain the grid, but if they have to reimburse solar owners at this rate, they're going to have to shift those costs onto non-solar households. So this can kind of generate, if we kind of think about how this might play out in the longer run, it might generate what has been referred to as a utility death spiral. So why is it a death spiral? That kind of sounds dramatic, but the way that it would work is, so some households adopt solar, and the utility realizes that they have to compensate them for the energy they're producing, but they still have to recover these grid costs. So their response will be to increase prices to recover those grid costs on non-solar owners. The non-solar owners will say, oh, my electricity bill is getting more expensive. Maybe I should go solar too, because if this is getting kind of out of hand and I can get compensated. More people go solar, then they have to increase rates again. You kind of play this cycle out. You get to a point where the utilities revenues are very low, but people still are relying on the electric grid. They still need the grid to exist at nighttime. Another kind of problematic feature of this result is, if we look in practice, who are the types of households that are adopting solar first, they typically tend to be high-income households. And so what that means is, if this cost shift is occurring in practice, that's going to create a regressive distributional effect where it's actually, making energy costs particularly higher for low-income households that are less likely to adopt this high fixed costs technology. Okay, so giving net metering a little bit of a hard time here. But if I had to give kind of another potential criticism of net metering is also potentially incentivizing the wrong renewables. So when I say the wrong renewables, we can put solar on a rooftop, or we can build solar in a large solar farm, right? So if you kind of go outside of town, you've probably driven by a large utility scale solar plant. If we look at the difference in costs between installing 1 watt of solar capacity on a rooftop compared to those utility scale solar farms, we see that it's about 3 times more expensive per watt to put it on a rooftop compared to building a huge facility in a field. And if we're worried about the climate problem in particular, it doesn't matter if the generation is happening on a rooftop or if it's happening outside of town somewhere. If it's getting put into the electric grid, we're getting the same effect. And so, you know, it seems obvious that the economics should be that we should be installing these large facilities that are coming at much lower cost compared to putting them on rooftops. Yeah.
Just one question online here. It's just sort of related to your net metering. So, do you believe utilities must evolve with technology like all industries and refine or reduce their transmission and distribution charges to solar users who also might have batteries, maybe, who are using the grid less than others? So I don't know, maybe you'll attack this or you can.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I probably was not gonna go into it too much, but I think that there's been some interesting proposals. You know, I think I wouldn't argue that solar shouldn't be compensated. Solar is adding benefit to the grid for sure, both in emissions reductions and providing electricity to the grid that other people can use. Now, what I would just argue that a rooftop solar facility should be getting paid the same amount as any other power plant that's generating from the grid. So if you, in Texas, for example, if you build a natural gas plant or a big solar farm, you're going to be compensated at the wholesale rate, not the retail rate. And so I would argue that, you know, rooftop solar should get that same compensation, not more. And the way that we can recover so they should be getting compensated, just probably shouldn't be at the full retail rate. And we need to recover the transmission and distribution charges, likely through a fixed charge. So this is just a part on your bill. It doesn't matter how much you're using, because the argument is even if a solar household is not using very much energy, then their energy charge should be low. But they still need the grid to be there if they're going to use electricity from the grid at all. So they should be paying their fair share in upkeep in the grid, but they won't have to pay very much in terms of the electrons that they're not using from the grid. Okay, so yeah, and you know, you could spend a whole talk thinking about rate reform. But that's kind of we can loop back to that later on if people are interested. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of states that have been rethinking net metering. So you look at kind of the orange states or places that still have net metering. So this policy has been quite popular across, you know, all of the U.S. You know, both red and blue states. But California is one recent example that actually is moving away from the full retail net metering recently. And in part because California has had a lot of adoption of solar, their electricity prices have become quite high. And they've realized kind of in the long run, this is probably not financially sustainable to continue to compensate solar owners at the full retail rate. And so in California, for example, you still are going to get compensation, but it's going to be closer to the wholesale rate instead of the retail rate. Okay, so the next policy that I want to talk a bit about are renewable energy mandates. So this is another policy that has mostly been implemented at the state level, but has been quite popular in practice. You'll often hear these policies referred to as renewable portfolio standards, or RPS for short. And what an RPS does is it requires a utility company to either produce or purchase a given share of their electricity from renewable sources or from eligible sources. So compliance is tracked through a renewable credit system, a renewable energy credit system. So every time, say, a solar or wind farm creates 1 megawatt hour of energy, they're going to get a credit that they can then sell to a utility for compliance. So the most simple way that it can get a little more complicated is a wind farm creates a unit of electricity. They sell the electricity and the credit to a utility, and the utility then turns in this credit to comply with the policy, and they need to have enough credits to meet the standard. So a lot of times these kind of scale up over time. Here's Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, California, and DC that all have RPS over time. So for example, in Connecticut, they had an RPS to be 27% renewable by 2020 and 48% by 2030. If we look at like DC, it's a lot more aggressive. So they actually have a 100% target by 2032. I'm not 100% sure, but if I had to guess, there's probably almost no power plants that actually exist in DC, but that obviously utility in DC has to buy power from someone else that's outside of the territory. And so they need to buy enough of these credits to comply with their usage. So the way that this works is kind of the RPS is calculated. If you're a utility company like Austin Energy, for example, we can track what are your total electricity sales, and then we can track electricity from renewables, which is how many of these credits you have. And you need to have enough of these credits handed in so that, you know, this ratio is above the standard imposed by the state. So of course, we can kind of see from the formula that there's a couple ways that a utility could potentially comply with this policy. One of them would be to increase the numerator, which is to increase the amount of renewables that they're either producing or purchasing. And then the second is to decrease electricity sales, so to decrease the denominator. So one thing that we should kind of think about here is that increasing renewables alone is not necessarily going to reduce carbon emissions. It only is going to do so indirectly in the sense that renewables might force fossil fuels off the grid. But you know, just adding more solar without decreasing fossil fuels isn't necessarily going to lead to lower emissions. You know, the impact of RPS is going to depend on compliance choices. Now, there's some recent research that's kind of looked at the history of RPS. And the good news is that, you know, one recent paper finds pretty substantial impacts on these RPS on actually getting carbon emissions to go down. This paper by Greenstone and Nath finds that about 70 years after an RPS has been enacted, emissions goes down by 10 to 25%. There's been some other work that's found a bit smaller effects, but you know, there is reason to believe these policies have been somewhat effective in reducing emissions. Obviously, a big benefit on the RPS end is it's feasible. So over 36 states have implemented some kind of RPS, some of them much stronger than others. But this has kind of been proven a policy that is implementable in practice. You know, one of the potential drawbacks is that RPS, research has shown RPS is likely to increase electricity prices. The reason is, of course, the utilities have to now buy these credits. They have to buy energy source or produce energy sources they may have not otherwise. And so therefore, that can tend to push up prices. Obviously, a drawback of RPS is that it doesn't encourage any kind of fuel switching between, say, coal and natural gas in the short run. So, you know, there's no incentive for a utility to shut down a coal plant compared to a natural gas plant under an RPS. Now, they might have incentive to close fossil fuels plants in general, so they need to produce more from renewables, but there's no kind of incentive to do fuel switching on the margin of between two fossil fuels that both emit, but one is dirtier than the other. One thing that I would say in terms of ways that, you know, RPS has seen some good results in terms of reducing emissions. It's politically feasible. if we want to think about ways for RPS to be the most effective, we want to think about RPSs that are the most flexible as possible. So if we look at different states, they implement these rules in different ways. Some of them say only solar complies for the RPS, or only solar and wind comply. But we can't. Other states are much more flexible in they might allow nuclear or hydro or geothermal, or even clean technologies like natural gas with carbon capture to comply with the policy. My intuition would be that typically more flexibility is going to lead to lower costs if we give utilities more ability to switch between different ways of meeting this policy. The ultimate goal is decarbonization. We shouldn't necessarily take a stand against particular technologies. I mean, all technologies are going to have some benefits and some drawbacks, but that's kind of my general intuition is RPSs should try to aim to be more flexible. And some states have done a good job of doing that. So the last policy that I want to talk about are renewable energy subsidies. So this is one policy that's actually that's happened at the local level, but has also been quite prominent at the federal level in the U.S. So at least in the context of solar, the U.S. government for quite a long time has given a pretty substantial upfront incentive for installing solar. And this applies to all kinds of solar plants, so be it a rooftop solar panel that you choose to install in your own house, or a big solar farm at the utility scale. But what the solar investment tax credit does is it offers a 30% tax credit for covering the construction cost of building the plant. So if you install on your rooftop or a utility builds a solar plant, they get 30% of that cost back from the federal government via a tax credit. And so this really makes a big dent in the upfront cost of building the technology. This is a tax credit that's been around for quite some time now, for a few decades. But it was recently renewed to 2032 under the Inflation Reduction Act a couple of years ago. So, kind of a couple of benefits of these investment subsidies. One is that an investment subsidy is unlikely to increase electricity prices. Now, I say that that's a benefit mostly in the context of feasibility. But if you think about what is like a solar tax credit doing, it's making it more cheap. It's making it cheaper to build solar plants. So we're going to see more solar power plants getting built. Once those plants get built, solar is zero marginal cost. It doesn't cost anything to produce. And so there's not really much of a channel why this would increase electricity prices. We actually probably expect it to decrease electricity prices, if anything. Different from an RPS, where a utility has to buy these credits and is being forced to switch fuels, and then they need to recover those costs from consumers. Another benefit that research has shown in terms of investment tax credits, and this could probably also be said for RPS to some extent as well, is that it supports innovation. So in the context of solar, we've had a pretty steady tax credit for building solar panels over time. And so what that's encouraged is us to build more of these things. Firms know that there's this incentive on the customer side, and so they have incentive to put more R&D into this technology. Also, we might see a learning by doing the fact where the more of these we build, the lower costs go. And so by kind of picking a technology and subsidizing, we might be able to move down a learning curve and be able to produce these things cheaper over time. Learning curves are kind of difficult to estimate empirically. So, credible research measuring this is hard to do, but I think most people's intuition is like we've learned to build solar panels better through doing. It's hard to prove that empirically, but we do know that solar's gotten much cheaper over time, and probably some of that has had to do with us just getting practice building more and more of that. Of course, benefit, political feasibility. A couple of drawbacks of investment subsidies is, even though that it doesn't come at a cost of increasing electricity prices, this is getting paid for somewhere. So an investment subsidy is going to have to be recovered from by the government tax system in some other place. So, the government is covering the cost of these solar panels. So they either, one, are going to have to raise taxes to cover that, income taxes. It's not a carbon tax, but they'll have to raise taxes somewhere else to recover that those costs, or they'll have to take on more debt, right? So the costs are still happening, they're just happening somewhere else and kind of being implemented somewhere in the tax system. Again, this doesn't encourage any switching from coal to natural gas, and doesn't encourage much energy conservation, right? We've talked about electricity prices. It's not really sending any kind of price signal that we should be conserving on the consumer.
We have questions online.
Yep.
Want me to ask?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Left there. So one is talking about increasing renewables, either through portfolio standards, for example. Maybe it's kind of a clarification. It does reduce pollution if it reduces the use of fossil resources, correct? I think your citation there was about reducing fossil generation and then counting the emissions from that.
Exactly.
So yeah, so you were attempting to address that question, so that's good. One here is just kind of about microgrids in general, or investments in distributed energy like solar and potentially batteries. So what do you think of arguments for sharing the cost of these grid investments, including exploring the payment of investments that might be stranded assets, for example, maybe even the federal government paying for stranded assets. I think ERCOT, or the electricity industry, is going into wholesale markets from fully regulated markets, have some sort of paying of stranded assets to some degree, or at least compensating no longer guaranteed revenue. So anyway, what about if new technologies cause some assets to seem quote unquote stranded, and is there any role of the government there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. My view is, there's a lot of unexpected events that happen both policy wise and not, that cause, particular investments to kind of go underwater. I think that one reason why we might want to think about compensating losers, it is because it might be important for making the policy feasible. So, in general, like, if my first priority might be like, paying back a large fossil fuel company for a sunk asset, I'm not. My intuition is that that's going to be important in the sense that it might make the policy more practical to implement, and for that reason, it may need to be something that's discussed. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So RPS is, at least in Texas, I think we're sunsetting ours in 2025-ish, November or so. And I know that there's been talk about, like, how do we get some of these other sources into the RPS, but whether it would even make a difference because it's going to be sunsetted, because it's, achieved its objectives. So what should Texas do going forward for RPSs to make sure ERCOT continues to meet their 8% year-over-year kind of objectives and have clean, firm, resilient energy on the grid?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure the Texas RPS is like 25 years old or something. It got passed in like 2000 or something like that. And it basically said, you know, I can't even remember, but it was some very low percentage, like 5 or 10%, by 2025. And like Texas has so much wind that they exceeded that RPS like massively, like 15 years before like the policy would. Now, so that's actually something to kind of keep in mind is that, you know, when I said 36 states have RPS, not all RPS are created equal. Now, in the case of Texas, what I would argue is that basically an RPS was implemented that wasn't binding. Wind would have been put in regardless of that RPS. That RPS probably didn't do anything. Wind just got cheap, and there was a lot of wind in the Panhandle, and a lot of wind got built in Texas, regardless of that very low RPS was in place or not. You know, one thing that Texas will have to consider going forward is, you know, RPS might be a lever to get further emissions beyond what is business as usual. But Texas actually surprisingly has a lot of renewables, and that's in large part because they have a lot of plentiful wind resources, and actually solar resources as well. So a lot more solar is coming into Texas. So an RPS is only actually going to do anything to the extent that the RPS is, you know, aggressive enough that it's requiring something that wouldn't have happened in the market on its own.
Got a few more questions, but maybe see what you might want to wrap
up. Okay, I go till 1:30. Okay, so I wanted to kind of loop back and kind of talk about these two different policies, kind of this carbon tax policy, which has been advocated by economists, and, you know, these policies that have actually been implemented much more in practice, which is these renewable mandates and subsidies. So if we kind of contrast what the incentives are between the two, what is a carbon tax going to do? Well, a carbon tax is going to encourage the retirement of power plants that have the highest combination of operation costs and emission costs. So say you're a power plant operator, you've got to pay for your fuel, you've got to pay for your operation and maintenance, and under a carbon tax, you also have to pay for all of the emissions that you're creating. So a carbon tax is going to encourage retirement of the plants that have the highest combination of both operating costs and emissions costs. On the other hand, renewable mandates or subsidies are also going to, you know, encourage more renewables, which should push some fossil fuels out of the market. But the fossil fuels that get pushed out of the market are typically just going to be the ones that have the highest operating costs. If I'm a utility and I have a natural gas or coal plant, and I have to offset it with renewables, I'm going to just get rid of whichever one is cheaper, is more expensive to operate. It doesn't matter which one is emitting. I just need to get more renewables. It doesn't matter, you know, what I replace the renewables with. So, you know, under a carbon tax, operating costs and emission costs matter, whereas under a renewable mandate, it's going to push out other fossil fuels, but it's going to particularly only push out fossil fuels with the highest operating costs. Now, kind of the encouraging thing, you know, don't have to pay too much attention to the graphs. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But the point I wanted to make on this slide is under current prices, coal plants have the highest operating costs and they have the highest emission costs. And so what that means is that under an RPS or under a carbon tax, coal plants are going to get retired first under both of those policies at current prices. And so at current natural gas prices, we might not expect as big of a difference in emissions that, you know, we might have thought about 10, 20 years ago. There might be actually not so much difference in the emissions effects of these two policies if they're set right. And I think that's promising because, you know, economists have been like, you know, carbon tax is the least cost way to go, but we may be kind of under a situation right now where you can use an RPS and get kind of pretty similar outcomes because of the fact that coal has the highest operating cost and the highest emission cost. Of course, if natural gas became really expensive again, then an RPS may not do as well, right? Because then under an RPS, it might encourage retirement of natural gas before coal. Okay, the other things I kind of want to think about, so this is from this Bornstein and Bushnell paper. What they look at in this paper is also kind of what is the impact of these three different policies on electricity prices. And what they found is like on the path to decarbonization, so the x-axis is percent of fossil fuels that have been retired in their simulations. What happens to electricity prices? So what they find is that carbon tax and clean energy standard, as I mentioned before, lead to the highest electricity prices, whereas a subsidy for renewables leads to lower electricity prices relatively. Now, there's some other things to keep in mind, because like I said, the investment subsidy isn't paid for in electricity costs, but it's paid for somewhere else in the tax system. So, you know, the government's either going to have to take on more debt, or they're going to have to raise taxes somewhere else to finance this policy that's going to lead to lower electricity costs. On the other hand, a carbon tax increases government revenue, potentially. So kind of, you know, as we consider these different policies, you know, it's important to keep in mind what are the distributional effects between them. So under a carbon tax, who's gonna be bear the biggest costs? Well, big emitters are gonna pay a big cost under a carbon tax, and also heavy energy or electricity users in the context of the electricity sector. If you're someone that uses a lot of electricity, carbon tax is going to hurt you relatively more. If you're someone that's emitting a lot of carbon, of course, it's going to hurt you more as well. On the other hand, a clean energy subsidy is still going to have costs. You know, we still have to pay to build all this new infrastructure, so costs are going to have to be paid somewhere. But it avoids concentrating losses on emitters and high volume consumers. Essentially, the costs under this system are much less transparent, and they get paid for under the hood somewhere in the broader tax system. And I think that this is one reason why these policies have been much more popular in practice, because if you were to implement a carbon tax, the losers of that policy it's going to be very obvious to them that this policy pushed up my electricity costs or pushed up my production costs. It's going to be very obvious. On the other hand, with the clean energy subsidy, the cost gets passed somewhere into the tax system, and it's not very easy for us to see where that cost is going. Before I wrap up, I just want to talk about a couple other considerations I haven't talked about too much today. One, kind of just getting back to this reliability trade-off as well. So as we're decarbonizing, one thing, of course, we want to keep in mind is that most of the renewables we've been adding, wind and solar, are intermittent. So we can't control when the output of a solar farm is happening or when the output of a wind farm is happening. It's going to depend on weather conditions. And so if we want to reach really ambitious decarbonization targets, renewables are likely going to have to be paired with some type of storage. So be it battery or a different technology. I have some research that I've been working on that's looked at kind of the economics of storage. And what we find in our work is that even if you have a renewable mandate, probably we won't see a lot of storage show up to the market unless the storage gets some kind of additional support. Now, you know, I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't support that. That's kind of, we need more work on that. But what we find is just because you have a bunch of solar coming to the market doesn't necessarily mean that we'll see storage show up unless there's additional subsidies or mandates for storage itself. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more offline if you want to hear about more of the intuition. So kind of what's going to be critical to getting to the point where we have storage is we're going to need to do a lot more R&D and reduce the cost of storage to make it more economical. Hopefully storage can kind of follow in the path of solar and wind, but it probably still needs to continue to make a lot of progress on costs if it's going to be economically viable without support. Sorry, my slides have been kind of screwed up today.
From the D's.
But okay, other considerations, US only produces 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. I've talked a lot about the US today. So one thing that we need to keep in mind is, you know, what's happening in other places as well. Obviously, if we want to keep warming in check, we're going to need lower income countries to avoid moving onto a high emissions path. Of course, we can't regulate other countries, and you know, I think it's actually, you know, in a lot of sense unfair to ask low income countries to make a lot of concessions when we've had the benefit of using a lot of fossil fuels in our development. So getting these other countries to stay on a low emissions path is really going to depend on the technology for clean energy to be quite cheap and affordable. They're only going to adopt it if it's in their economic interest to do so. And so one kind of policy that I haven't talked about a lot about today is supporting R&D for clean technology, because that's likely to have spillovers to other countries outside of our own, in the sense that if we make solar or batteries cheaper, that's going to make it the technology cheaper for other places. Other places are going to be more likely to adopt, and we're going to get benefits back from them reducing their emissions. Okay, so I'll kind of leave it to that. Obviously, decarbonization in electricity is going to be important, but we should be aiming to achieve these reductions at the lowest cost possible. Of course, distribution, reliability, and R&D spillovers to other countries are other important consideration when we're thinking about policy goals. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. All right.
Right, so we have at least a couple of questions online, but anybody else in the room? Okay, one in the room. Then...
So last semester we had Steve Keen speak, and one of his things was kind of that we don't have the right indicators in the market, right? And so the carbon tax is trying to just tax that externality so that it actually shows up in the markets. And right, politics does dictate what's feasible, and so that is currently unlikely. But I guess I'm wondering, you know, we have the IRA, which is this other way of trying to get to the same goal. That's also incredibly expensive. Is there a way to, I don't know, compare projected revenues of like a carbon tax with the cost right now of the IRA? Is it, you know, just to present it to people in a different manner?
There's a related question online, so I'm going to paraphrase the question online, which is, should we be equating something like renewable subsidies to revenues, in the sense that the government spends money and that's independent of how it receives revenues? So should we even link these two things together, given we spend money on military and fossil subsidies, et cetera? Related question.
Yeah, so I think like that, to answer your question, economists have kind of try to do that all the time. So assess different policies and kind of put them on an equal playing field. I think economists get criticized a lot for like trying to put everything in dollar terms, but the reason that we like to do that is because it allows you a metric to compare two complicated policies. If you don't have a common unit for comparison, it's very difficult to make an actionable decision. And so, you know, when we look at kind of carbon tax compared to you know, like an investment subsidy, it encourages more margins of emissions reductions, and so I think that's why it probably would be a little bit more cost effective, although there's current conditions that I talked about with the current natural gas prices, maybe it's not as different as in other cases. I mean, I think that that's promising because that means that there's a policy available that's somewhat similar that would likely come at a similar aggregate cost to society. So on the second question of like, should we be comparing? Yeah, I mean, I think we should consider they're separate issues, but we need to consider costs even if they're showing up somewhere else. So if we, pay, one of the reasons we might care about climate change is because it's going to impose damages on future generations, right? So, okay, there's more wildfires in the future. There's more droughts in the future. So future generations are going to have to pay costs because of those. Well, if we build a lot of renewables and we just put it in government debt, then someone else is going to have to, future generations might have to pay for that, right? So in that sense, I think we do need to consider that cost when analyzing policies. It may not be the end all be all, but it should be something that we consider.
Okay, one more online.
Could you briefly explain why you didn't mention about cap and trade and carbon trading for carbon reducing
Yeah,
and a viable policy alternative?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, mostly just because not enough time, and I wanted to kind of, just I would put cap and trade in kind of a similar bucket, and it's also kind of economists really like both of those policies. If you're kind of clever about how you set the cap or how you set the tax, they can create very similar incentives under a lot of situations. Carbon trading, I think it's also in the same bucket that like it has been a little bit more implemented in practice compared to taxes, but it's also been difficult to implement in the US. So like California has a cap and trade program. We almost passed one under the Obama administration in 2009 or 2010. It ultimately didn't pass. And my sense is the same as carbon pricing, and I don't see it being likely to be passed at the federal level, at least in the US. But short answer, it creates a lot of the same incentives and has a lot of the same properties that carbon tax would have, potentially being more feasible in that it's not a direct tax, and you can kind of give out free permits to polluters, potentially to raise support for the policy.
All right, well, there's one more here, which is kind of related. Carbon capture, one form or another on power plants or direct air capture. We do have incentives now and subsidies for this. And some have been around for a while, but we haven't seen too much. So do you have any insights or thoughts on whether you would expect these same policies that in some sense incentivize renewables to start incentivizing actual carbon capture projects on the ground, and why or why not? It's just different nature of the beast somehow.
Yeah, so I kind of talked about renewable standards and renewable subsidies because that's what we've seen historically. Obviously, carbon capture is a much newer technology that hasn't been as developed as far, but the IRA actually does have similar types of incentives for carbon capture. So I think that we can think of that as another technology, and we can give subsidies in the same way for carbon capture that we can for renewables. And you could imagine having one thing I did touch on is when we say renewable portfolio standards, this is oversimplifying, but my approach to it is, the problem is carbon, it's not fossil fuels. So, if a fossil fuel plant can produce without creating carbon, it should qualify for being clean energy, right? It's no longer, if it's able to capture and store the carbon safely, that should be included in a clean energy standard, just like a renewable should.
All right, we'll end it there. So thank you again, Jackson Dorsey.